Hello and welcome to the Popcorn Junkies. Welcome to this review of the A24 horror slasher movie, Maxine. Or is it a horror slasher movie? Anyway, it's the final film in a trilogy of films. The first film was X, the second film was Pearl, and this is the third. And some say final, though the director, Ty West, is suggesting there may be a fourth outing. So X told the story of a sort of porn film crew making, not soft porn, hardcore porn, in a kind of barn, and they go to film it, and Mia Goth, Maxine, is a member of the team, and they stumble across the old woman in the house who's Pearl, who herself had sort of, desires to be famous and on the silver screen, but she in her thwarted life, her thwarted attempt to become famous, she kind of sort of becomes obsessed with this kind of crew that are making a porn film and such, and so the horror sort of emerges in X. And the horror in X was very much through the lens of really the horror of an old woman wanting to get down and get dirty with younger people, and then of course it was the horror of her dispatching with them and getting rid of them and killing them, classic kind of slasher movie sort of stuff. Pearl gave us the origin story of the old woman in X, and I think Pearl was a sensational film with Mia Goth at the heart. And it's interesting when you reflect on the production time and the ways in which these films were made. X had sort of time given to it, and Pearl was made much more quickly, much more swiftly, and on a shorter sort of schedule, and was more sort of shot from the hip. And yet I would say of the two, Pearl was a much more sort of successful, well-conceived and well-rounded and deep character study. Really, I mean, you have to kind of put all of the kind of responsibility for Pearl's success really at Mia Goth's feet, but also I think the way in which it was executed, the sense of cinema, the sense of aspiration to want to become a starlet, the sense of it riffed a great deal on things like The Wizard of Oz and all that kind of stuff. Beautifully made, brilliantly made, beautifully performed, chilling, unsettling, and as I said at the time, Mia Goth very much felt like a sort of Shelley Duvall type kind of actress. She took us to dark, difficult places within this character, both vulnerable and psychopathic. So those were the two films. And so Maxine, this film, picks up the story, if you like, of the original girl from X who survived as she heads into 80s Hollywood and wants to transition from being essentially a porn actress or a porn star into more serious cinema. And this is a film that's kind of, from the trailer you may have seen, it's kind of suffused with 80s kind of iconography, the 80s quality of image making, VHSs, videos, video nasties, top-loading cassette machines, neon lights, chintzy music. I mean, there was a montage at the beginning of this film, Maxine, that's very like Late Night with the Devil, where we're painted a scene of the sort of the 80s in this. It's the 70s, I think, in that film. But all sorts of kind of, twisted, dark, satanic-like things. And of course, this film is set around the same time, 1985, as the Night Stalker murders are happening in Los Angeles. So all three films really are about fame, they're about stardom, they're all about, and they all pivot around really that difficult little kind of area of the sort of sex industry and the porn industry, and how women are kind of asked to kind of, commodify and make commercial their bodies, and how, where's the Faustian Pact? How much of it is a Faustian Pact where you trade your sort of, if you like, your self-respect and your physicality and your femininity, and you're seeking something called fame? There's a wonderful quote at the beginning of this film which flashes up, and for me this was a harbinger of great things to come. The quote is by Betty Davis, and the quote says this: "In this business, until you're known as a monster, you're not a star. In this business, until you're known as a monster, you're not a star." Now, I can think of many people I've worked with, and I know Nadia will be able to think of many people she's worked with, for whom this strapline or this statement or maxim, not Maxine, maxim, is entirely applicable. The idea that until you're monstrous and difficult and horrendous to work with, you're not a star. You need to get past a certain point of niceness and humanity and kindness. And I would say that, that quote, that sort of quote at the front of this film very much prefigures the idea that this is a film in which we watch Mia Goth's Maxine character navigate that sort of that tightrope between humanity, a connection with her past, an awareness of the trauma of her youth and her childhood. You know, she was brought up by a kind of strict TV evangelist type father. So how she navigates who she is and what she feels, her loyalty to friends, her position in the world, versus adopting a more sort of, I don't know, sort of vicious and sort of, sadistic and competitive side to herself in order to survive within this world that is Hollywood. The film goes to great lengths, I think, to really kind of give us that sense, a sort of grindhouse sense, that grindhouse look of neon lights, you know, where the neon and the colour in most of the scenes in this film bleeds at the edges. You know, it's very grainy, it's very sort of lo-fi, low res. That's all great, that's all good. I mean, it's nothing new, and I think there's some argument that at times in this film, while style is a hugely important factor in the previous two films, sometimes with this, I felt the film was trying too hard to give us the sense of 80s-ness or mid-80s-ness, and at times I felt actually it was prioritising sort of era truth or era kind of believability of the 80s, and it was sacrificing kind of story and characterisation in order to make us really feel like we're in the 80s, which is, I think, one of my problems that I have with this film. That said, this film starts with a brilliant audition moment, or a moment where she sort of performs a line into camera, and it's really interesting that this film starts with a scene like that, because Pearl, although it didn't end exactly with a sort of great long monologue with Pearl's character, Mia Goth again in that film, towards the end of that film there was a really long and intense monologue moment where she talks about herself and her feelings and her emotions, and you're in her head and you're like, oh my god, this woman's mad. But there's also a really strong audition piece in Pearl where she tried to audition for a film or a show that she wanted to be in there, and in a sense these films are at their strongest, and certainly Pearl was, and this film was, when it wasn't trying to do all of the kind of, you know, stylistic 80s stuff, where it just sat with Mia Goth. The secret weapon in all these films is Mia Goth, and I think with this film, of the three, it kind of got hijacked with trying to kind of do too many things in quite a sophisticated and at times confused fashion within quite a kind of vast landscape of Los Angeles. And weirdly, what I think worked with the last two films, Pearl and X, was that it was all very much located to her farm and her barn. And whereas, yes, in Pearl, she kind of went to the local town and then came back, there was a containment to the horror and a containment to the characters. Whereas here, in a weird way, you feel the kind of sprawling mass of Los Angeles and the hugeness of the subject of Hollywood. So it was kind of harder to kind of pin down the moments. This is a curious film. I mean, it's a film, as I say, it indulges in grand guignol. It purposefully tries to blur, I think, the boundaries between what is she living, what is she doing, what is she actually experiencing in her life in LA versus what films is she making. I thought there was going to be a moment at the end of this film where it was all kind of turned around. It was all very meta, and we were like, oh right, this was the film itself. There are many flashbacks to the earlier films. We've got a sense, as I say, of this sort of murderer who's kind of, you know, the night stalker who's kind of going around killing people. But we've also got a sense of this guy who's got leather gloves. Who could he be, the night stalker? Who seems to be tracking her and following her and wanting to know who she is and where she is, and in everywhere she goes, certain characters are dying. And I think this film works best where it's playing up and it's exploiting the ambivalence between, because I think what the film's trying to say is there's the night stalker doing all his murders, but then there's these people who are all very close to Maxine who are dying. And I think the film purposefully tries to make oblique whether Maxine's dad, who is perhaps the guy that's following her and tracking her, is Maxine's dad the night stalker. If Maxine's dad is the Night Stalker, then she has in her DNA the psychopathy of a psychotic killer. And I felt it was kind of asking all those questions. I think it's purposefully kind of blurred at the edges as to who's, you know, how that works, who's related to who. When we get to a point later in the film where she's actually kind of face to face with her dad, her father, who's a kind of evangelist, and he's kind of doing all that stuff. I mean, this film is going to speak to all of the conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorists that talk about the, you know, and I'm not saying this hasn't happened, but I just haven't seen my own evidence of, you know, satanic rituals in the Hollywood Hills, you know, the whole Charles Manson thing. But this idea that Hollywood itself is evil and eats children, and, you know, the paedophiles and all that kind of stuff. This film very much kind of speaks to that, but it does it in a very sort of garish 80s, sort of fizzy and light-hearted fashion in a sense. Unlike, say, something, I'm thinking of things like Mulholland Drive or Lost Highway. You know, when Lynch goes there, it's dark and seedy and it's under the surfaces and all that kind of stuff. This was kind of all out front, but it wasn't creepy. And that was something that surprised me about this. I think one of the things this film struggled with was being scary in the way that I found the other two films, well, Pearl more so, you know, quite scary and unsettling because this was so sort of breezy and so stylistic and so sort of fizzy, if you like, with 80s-ness. And because it was also quite arched, and I think this is where, you know, characters like Kevin Bacon's that came into it were problematic, because I wasn't convinced by Kevin Bacon in this. I know a couple of reviewers have said, oh, he's brilliant as this. I think he overplayed it. I think he massively overacted. I know what they were going for. They were going for a kind of kitsch, tongue-in-cheek, sort of caricature, if you like, of the villain. Or he's not even a villain, but he's the cop who's kind of tracking her and doing it for the guy with the gloves that make the really wrinkly sound. I didn't even feel that, you know, in its portrayal of the porn scene, you know, she works in a kind of one of those really sinister kind of viewing booth places where you put a coin in and then the glass thing goes up and you watch her dance for you. And again, we've got the guy, it's in the trailer, you've got the guy with the kind of really, the loud leather gloves, which were doing my nut in. It verged on camp, and it verged on silly, and it verged on comedy, I think more than it perhaps necessarily intended to. A small example of that, in one of the scenes, like when she's working in one of these booths where you put a dime in and then the shutter comes up and she performs for you, there was a really nice tracking shot coming through the entrance to this place. And for me, that shot could have been held for so much longer to give us a sense of going into hell. And in a weird way, there was none of that taking us into hell. It just kind of, it made the assumption that we were in hell, but the hell that we were in, the Hollywood hell that we were in this film, was still quite light-hearted. And weirdly, because it was paying reference to so many other sort of fictions and films and devices, lots of kind of riffing and references, most obviously to Hitchcock, right down to Elizabeth Debicki's character looked incredibly like Grace Kelly. And at times, Mia Goth, or Maxine in this film, looked very much like Janet Leigh in Psycho. And this film, I think this film wanted to have its cake and eat it. I think it was trying too ambitiously in too many areas to be both meta, film literate, film, you know, parking itself in amongst all this kind of film kind of history and knowledge. So, for example, they literally have a scene where she runs up to the house from Psycho, because the house from Psycho is on the Universal lot. If you go on the tour, on the Universal tour, we did, you drive past it, and when you're on the tour, a guy runs out pretending to be Anthony Perkins and runs at the sort of the tram that you're on. It's quite scary, you know. And the reason they're on this set is because this is quite self-referential. It's quite meta, you know. They're on the film sets because she's making films. She manages to get herself cast and all this kind of stuff. It's very film literate, but weirdly, it kind of falls short of all the films it's referring to. So you have a moment where, you know, she's hiding in the house that Psycho was shot in, and Kevin Bacon's trying to get to her. And yet, in a weird way, it all felt too comic or too, not cartoon, but just too fictional. So in that sense, I never really felt we were getting to the kind of emotional rawness or truth of Maxine's character as much as we did with Pearl. I think where this film was really interesting, and I think where they could have actually afforded to put their foot down on the gas a bit more with this, it keeps it oblique, the extent to which Maxine herself, in her own sort of ambition and aspirations to be successful and to get the role, it clearly is suggesting that she's somehow culpable and responsible for the downfall and death of these women who all keep saying, oh, we're going to a party in the Hollywood Hills. We definitely are left by the end of the film, or I was left at the end of the film, I'm not too sure if you're meant to be left like this, thinking, which of these did she kill? Did she lure these women? Did she encourage them to go somewhere where she knew they would die? To what extent does the apple not fall far from the tree? And if her father, this evangelist, who is he the man? I think he is the man with the kind of leather kind of gloves, who's in the car following her around. Well, he's doing these sacrificial kind of rituals up in his Hollywood Hills home, killing people. And we see a scene, and we see a shot of Lily Collins' body, her head and her limbs falling out of a suitcase that falls down the stairs. I felt the film was at its best when it was blurring the distinctions between the evil and malice and psychopathy of him. Where's the Night Stalker and all of this? Is the film suggesting he's the Night Stalker? Is her dad the Night Stalker? Is she kind of killing? Is she committing crimes and getting rid of her competition in the business by sort of using the cloud cover of the Night Stalker? Who is the Night Stalker her dad? Or using the cloud cover of the Night Stalker and her dad? You know, to what extent was Maxine luring? But I felt they needed to kind of, although it was kind of inferred and you can come out of this film drawing your own conclusions and going, well, that's what I think was happening. I mean, I come out of it thinking she absolutely, Maxine, led all of these girls to their deaths. She wanted success. She wants fame. Because that's the mission statement of the three films, really, is what are you willing to do to become famous? And I think that's an interesting line of kind of, you know, inquiry, and right down to, you know, by the end of this film, she is the star. She's become the star of a film called The Puritan 2. It's not even the original film, it's a sequel, the one that's being directed by Elizabeth Debicki. And what's nice about this film is it does speak to the struggles. Elizabeth Debicki's character is brilliant because she talks about wanting to be an artist and how hard it is to establish yourself and how you've kind of got to tick these boxes to be what you want to be and do what you want to do. And she's sort of saying to Maxine, you know, be careful, you've got to, you know, there's the brutality and you've got to kind of sacrifice yourself, but at the same time, you've got to go for it. You know, all of that stuff I think is really rich, but it kept, in a weird way, it didn't, I think it needed to go darker. It was too, what was it? It was too, not cartoon, but it was too obsessed with period fun, I think. I think it was too obsessed with having fun with stylistic choices, musical choices, you know, location choices to give us that sort of sense of, wow, we're really in the 80s, you know, right down to the whole final scene of the film, if you like, the sort of denouement, happens literally beneath the Hollywood signs, you know, the sign, beneath the letters. You know, there's that age-old story of one of those, back in the day, an actress who threw herself off the H to her death or something. It's a sort of urban myth, but I think there's some truth in it. So this idea that this is all literally happening, you know, this drama, this psychodrama and psychotic kind of, you know, mass murder kind of horror is all happening in the actual literal shadows of the letters of the Hollywood sign. You know, all of that stuff, it's like they went too on the nose with it. I think it needed to be smaller in scope. I think it needed to be, you know, we got no real sense. For example, she had a really strong relationship with the guy who ran the VHS store. I like that. You know, it was a good opportunity for us to look at old kind of film posters, to be reminded of how, you know, VHSs and video cassettes, you know, they were a big thing. And when they were being pirated, there's a moment where she brings a video, she says, someone's dropped this video at my place, can you? And he goes to work it out and the type of video, but his character wasn't really developed, and none of the other girls, the other actresses' characters were drawn out too much, so you didn't really care about any of them at all. And although you cared about Maxine, I didn't see or feel enough vulnerability in her. She was kind of quite vacant a lot of the time, which was fine, because if she is the actual killer, if she is a kind of serial killer hiding behind other serial killers and hiding behind a fucking weirdo father, then that explains it all. But I could have done with more of a kind of arc, I think, to even her story. Also in there, Giancarlo Esposito, he's in there. He's okay. He's kind of got a weird kind of Tony Bennett-like wig, very strange. It's a great moment where he literally in a car squasher, you know, in a sort of where you take wrecked old derelict cars and they mash them up into kind of metal cubes. They dispatch of a key character in one of those machines, and once he's been squeezed, quite literally, and the blood is dripping and the Doberman dogs are licking the remains. Pretty grim moment that was. He turns to her and says, and she says, oh, thank you. And he goes, that's what agents are for. You know, that was funny. There were some funny moments. I think he has fun with it. Giancarlo Esposito's good. I found Kevin Bacon too much. I know he was trying to play an archetype. He was just trying to do that sort of that classic B-movie, you know, right down to, you know, the fact that he had a broken nose, so he had kind of like a stitch mark across here, and he had the cap, and he was following her and all that kind of stuff. It was too obvious. It was too caricature-y. It was too much. And so you know, there was a whole reservoir of just really deep, dark, mucky, sinister stuff that could have come from him, and actually he was a bit too two-dimensional. And I think that's one of the problems, I think, throughout this film. The whole thing just felt a bit too obvious and a bit too much like they were having fun making it, rather than actually exploring anything much deeper. And I think of the three films, I think there's a lot of interesting moments in this. It's a visual kind of feast. It's stimulating. It's riffing. There's filmic references everywhere. You know, you're getting Brian De Palma all over. You're feeling things like Carrie. There are moments where heads explode. There's a guy who gets his bollocks, testicles, and scrotum scrunched into the floor by her. I just wanted more moments of her psychopathy. There's lots of drug taking, nice big fat close-ups of, you know, sparkly cocaine on mirrors and all that kind of stuff. So it had all that, Boogie Nights, it had that sort of feel to it. You know, there's lots kind of, it's a visual kind of feast, if you like, but almost it was so glittering with beauties. It was such an embarrassment of visual riches. It lost that kind of deeper reservoir of emotional sort of twistiness and kind of unsettlingness and all that kind of stuff, which I think Pearl beautifully had. So I would say this has in no way bettered Pearl. Pearl for me is the best of the three. I'd probably say this is more entertaining or interesting than even X, because I think X was a bit of a disappointment, because I just felt it was just kind of really labouring the point that this is an old woman who wants to have sex with young people, and that was just a bit sick. It was a kind of cheap horror for me. Throughout all three, Mia Goth is sensational. In the moments where you're just looking at Mia Goth's face, she's one of those actresses, I can just look at her doing nothing. I mean, there was a scene where she's getting, there was one pot, she had like a china pot of just cocaine that she was just kind of feeding up her nose, and for the addict and the alcoholic in me, it was just like, wow, God, those were the days, my friend, those were the days. So what would I give it? I wasn't scared. There were moments where you kind of went, ha! It was grindhousey. It was Tarantino-esque in the way that heads explode in his films, and bollocks are squished and all that kind of stuff. I was getting it. Was weird that this has come out a year or so after, Late Night with the Devil. It felt very similar in tone and feel, and the same problem I had with that film I kind of had with this, which is both of them became obsessed with recreating the era and recreating the vibe, that they lost track of the truth of the story, or the truth even of the internal horror and all that kind of stuff. So if I was to score this, I'd probably give this 68 out of 100.